begins with attempts like those of Plato to reconcile abstract concepts like truth, beauty, and goodness with external physical realities. So you might want to look for reference at Plato's Republic, Book 7, written around the year 380 BCE. Plato believed that everything in the material world was a pale imitation of something in the world of ideas, right? And essentially everything was an imitation of the ideal forms of truth, beauty, and goodness. The further removed it was from these ideal forms, the more impure, the worse it was, right? So for Plato, poetry being merely a kind of imitation of actions is itself a kind of inferior mode of understanding, like you say, philosophy. So Aristotle's Poetics actually kind of bridge the gap between mimetic and pragmatic criticism. So these are composed around these are two texts composed around 335 BCE. One focuses on comedy and the other on tragedy. The one on comedy is lost. We only know it through references in other works. And yeah, so what we get in what we have of the Poetics is a descriptive account of tragic poetry. Right? This is what it looks like. Poetry for Aristotle is an imitation of an action, the aim of which is catharsis, right? So he's focused here not just on the fact that it's an imitation of an action, but on the fact that this actually has an impact on an audience, right? So catharsis is supposed to be this communal kind of purging of negative emotion that occurs as people experience vicariously the fate of the tragic hero. And for Aristotle, the focus in tragedy is really on helping audiences reconcile themselves to social norms, right? To get all those antisocial impulses out, once a year during the city Dionysia, and then go back to living normal, productive, average citizen lives. The Roman criticism also tends to be relatively pragmatic. So if you look at, for example, the work of Horace, the author of the Ars Poetica around 19 BCE, Horace stresses the imitation of Greek models, especially of Homer, and an attitude that he calls decorum, right? For Horace, decorum means that the language, the meter, the characterization of the poem, its genre must all fit its subject matter, right? So there's a specific meter in which you are supposed to write epic. If you write an epic poem in some other meter, then it's not really an epic, right? You need to fit your material to the specific style. And what you're trying to achieve in poetry for Horace is balance and harmony. Right? You want all the parts of the poem to fit together into a kind of organic, balanced whole that is pleasing to the audience and will, as he says, instruct and delight. Now, Longinus, who is relatively contemporary with Horace, but is kind of rediscovered later, wrote a treatise called On the Sublime, in sometime in the 1st century of the Common Era. Now, for Longinus, the moral excellence of writers is their criterion for greatness. So he is also kind of thinking on in terms of like instruct and delight, right? That these great writers provide a good moral example for audiences to follow. And for Longinus, the sublime is an elevated style of writing that takes its subject matter and picks it up out of the realm of the ordinary, right? It kind of makes it in some way special or extraordinary. Which leads readers to a form of ecstasy, right? So this is where he departs from Horace, right? You know, where Horace is kind of imagining you sitting in your little book-lined study, you know, pondering lines of poetry and kind of like reasoning your way through them. Longinus is concerned with the way poetry like will actually kind of excite the fibers of your being, if that makes sense. Now, in late antiquity and the Middle Ages, Scripture is read according to a scheme developed by Augustine of Hippo. So Augustine argues that Scripture can and should be read in three different senses, right? There's a literal sense, right? That's just the basic narrative of what happens in the scriptural text. The allegorical sense, in which events in the Old Testament prefigure events in the life of Jesus as depicted in the Gospels. The moral sense, in which stories from Scripture provide moral instruction. And finally, the anagogical sense, in which stories in Scripture point to elements of the afterlife and the final judgments. So, for most of kind of like late antiquity and the early Middle Ages, this is applied strictly to the Bible, right? Strictly to scriptural texts. This gentleman here, Dante Alighieri, begins kind of attaching it to secular texts as well. So he's kind of using this as a theoretical lens through which to read secular literature. Now, in the 14th through the 16th centuries, the study of classical texts in European universities leads to a philosophical orientation that comes to be called humanism. Right, here we have an illustration. This is Leonardo da Vinci's Vitruvian Man, right? The idea of humanity as the human being as the symbol of the macrocosm, measure of all things. So, humanists stress the importance of understanding human nature to realize humanity's potential, right? So, to a medieval thinker, humanity was fallen, right? Our state was fallen, and we could only be redeemed in the afterlife through penitence, right? To a humanist thinker, humanity actually possesses vast potential. But in order to reach that potential, we need to study what come to be called the humanities: grammar, logic, literature, philosophy, art, and history, right? That these are the necessary elements of real human flourishing. And it's kind of in these Renaissance universities, right, that the study of the humanities as we know it is really kind of born and in a way institutionalized. Now, in the 17th and 18th centuries, the era that comes to be called the Enlightenment, we find two different philosophical orientations coming into being in Europe, both of which will influence the development of literary theory. The first which is more popular in continental Europe, is called rationalism. And rationalism is inspired primarily by mathematics, by Newtonian physics, and by Cartesian geometry, both fairly new things in the 17th century. So rationalist believes that the world is governed by consistent, inviolable scientific and mathematical laws, right? Think, gravity. Not only does gravity always work the same way, right? It can be tested, it can be observed, and it can be expressed in terms of mathematical formulae. So these laws can be observed, they can be tested, and used to predict events. A rationalist also believes that the thing that really makes us human is our capacity for reason. That this is something that's inborn and that is unique to us. That's something that animals don't possess. Descartes, for example, kind of writes about how a parrot might learn to speak, but it's basically just like that animals are basically just kind of machines that learn certain rote behaviors and never really think about them. But only human beings reason. So the rationalist believes in an orderly universe in which human beings really are kind of still the most important thing, right? Now, in Britain, a philosophy called empiricism rules. Thinkers like John Locke, David Hume, George Berkeley. So to an empiricist, human beings are born as blank slates, right? The phrase that Locke uses, for example, is tabula rasa, Latin for blank slate, right? We are when we enter the world, we know nothing, right? Our brains are empty. And our only means of gaining knowledge is through our senses, right? So through sense impressions, right, marks are made on that blank slate that translate to knowledge. But our senses are also unreliable. They can deceive us. And so what rationalists call scientific laws, according to an empiricist, are just attempts by humans to give order to our own impressions and our own experience of the world. Now, both of these viewpoints will have an impact on literary theory as it develops. So the primary modes of thinking about literature from the 17th through the 19th centuries, the early 19th century anyway, are Neoclassicism and Romanticism. So Neoclassicists are influenced directly by Horace, right? The Ars Poetica is their Bible. They believe in the imitation of Greek and Roman models. French playwrights of the 17th century, for example, went so far as to insist that plays follow the same patterns described by Aristotle, not realizing that Aristotle was being descriptive rather than prescriptive. The usual subject of a neoclassicist text is human social life. And a neoclassicist believes that literature is a craft that anyone can learn to do, right? If you learn the rules, if you absorb and observe all of the practices, right? Anybody can be a poet. Anybody can be a playwright. And they stress regularity, balance, and decorum in their work. The form, which for a neoclassicist, at least in English language literature, usually takes the form of iambic pentameter couplets, is more important than the content. They also show a disdain for supernaturalism or superstition of any kind. Now, the